All right, kick it
Yeah,
off
yeah,
for us,
yeah.
please. Okay, so
So I'll
you
probably
have
just push.
this, add this to
Yeah,
stage.
I'll probably just push the same thing as I did last time, but I'll try and do it more succinctly
Okay,
and more sort of to
yeah,
the point. Um,
okay.
you question how a non-theist can ground normative truths, but what is the relevant difference between theism and atheism, such that theism can ground normativity and atheism seemingly can't? So that'd probably be the main question I'd ask.
Oops. All right, so theists can ground. You question how non-theists can ground normative truths. What is the relevance between theism and atheism, such that theism can ground normativity and atheism seemingly can't? All right, so yeah, so uh, I think that having God in the picture as the ground of all reality and the ultimate being, right there, um, provides something that atheism doesn't. Because if you don't, like I gave the example of the simulation hypothesis, scenario. Because if there's somebody outside of this universe that says this is how things go, even if that's utterly subjective, right? Let's just grant that it is. Like, I don't think that it is, but even if that's utterly subjective, because that person is in such a different, like, ontological position than I am, namely all powerful, all knowing, can create things that I can't, just way more powerful, that's going to carry far greater weight than mine. So there's that, but you, so, so I, if you wanted to, and of course you're going to kick back and you're going to say, well, that doesn't seem to do the trick to ground, like to totally erase normativity on the atheist side. I think that, not to say anything for you, but I'll stop there. What's your thoughts on what I've said so far?
So, from what I understand, you almost take a subjectivist approach, but you have the God's subjective approach is superior to ours. Would that be fair?
Assuming, yeah. So I don't buy subjectivism, but I'm trying to get as close to your position as possible. I don't even know if your position is subjectivism, but is it?
No, I'm a
Oh,
moral
okay, okay.
realist.
Okay, okay, okay. So, yeah, it's hard to keep all these ideas straight. Now, I'm a moral realist as well. So, okay, so this question is about how an atheist can ground moral realism. Is that the idea? Okay, gotcha.
Well, the normative facts of moral realism. So the atheist could say, okay, X is good, Y is bad, but how do they derive? From what I saw you asked, how do they derive? You ought to do X, you ought not do Y.
Hmm. Yeah. So let me ask you this: where do you think the atheists would be getting these objective moral principles and odds from the normative dimension? You wanted to say, I think, let me speak for you, but go ahead and answer. Sorry.
Um, well, I'm not supposing any. Well, I have my own view about where they come from. I'm not particularly supposing any place they come from. I'm just sort of asking, how come the theist can do that and the atheist can't? On your view,
Yeah, got you. Um, well, I imagine you'd say something like this, and stop me if I'm getting you wrong or anything like that. But not that I'm describing your view, but it's something you could possibly say. I think we had talked about this before in comments. You had mentioned something like, suppose normativity is just baked into the universe. That way, you don't have to worry about deriving it from not, and that way, normativity is just already there. I can get on board with that, but it it's then at that point just a brute fact that normativity, there's no explanation for why this would be the case. And so for the theist, though, it's not going to ground out just to a brute fact that normativity is just normativity, because then, of course, you're going to say, well, God, of course, is the ground of these normative facts. And so that's my answer. What do you think?
so maybe we should just sort of put aside anything that I would particularly say. If we just look at
Mhm.
atheism and theism prima facie, why would theism be able to ground normativity and atheism wouldn't? What
Let me
is
pull
it
this down.
about God existing that meant you could ground normativity, but I couldn't? I'm not an atheist, but that would be
Oh,
the
okay.
question.
Okay. Um, because God is ontologically basic. He's a fundamental entity of the universe. And so everything's just going to get grounded into him. And so normativity gets grounded into him by extension. So Yeah, but as an atheist, you don't have recourse to that. You would just say, I understand the tension here, because then I imagine you'd push back and you'd say, well, I'm grounding normativity as just being basic. And then I would say, well, I think God is basic. You think normativity is basic. And so is that seem the right estimation of like where the impasse is?
I wouldn't particularly I wouldn't particularly push there. I'd
Yeah. Okay.
probably just ask God say, okay, God grounds everything. You say God grounds normativity. What does that mean? What grounds normativity?
That there would be an explanation for it. So I'm taking the tack of when anything exists, like the principle of sufficient reason or something, like anything exists, you're going to have an explanation. Either there's going to be no explanation, in which case the principle of sufficient reason doesn't apply, or if it does have an explanation for its existence, it's either going to be interior or exterior to it. So I'm saying with respect to normative facts, those are not. I'm going to deny that they have the explanation for the existence just within themselves, and I'm also going to deny that they have no explanation. I think that they do. And so I'll take that third tack and I'm say, well, the explanation lies outside. Now, I don't know. I guess I hadn't done too much reading on this to have arguments for that, other than um, really feeling the pull of that intuition, like that those shouldn't be like if you have a normative, like the same thing with like I guess an analogy is like as a parent, you have a kid being like, well, why should I do that? Like having that to be a brute fact is really unsatisfying. Look, you just should. Like it seems like there would be a reason there if you're going to have something be a should. See what I mean? So like I don't. Yeah, so that's kind of why I resist the idea of normativity being baked in and just being a brute fact. I resist that because I think it has an explanation for itself outside of something. Do this, you should do this, but why? That's going to be that further why, and this is what the theist is going to point to. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so I'd probably ask, you've got the Isor gap, right? And you're trying to find out where you derive normativity. So you have the two views, you have atheism and theism, and you're saying, okay, on theism, we can ground normativity because we just have God and God grounds normativity. How does that even make sense? How can you can just, suppose God to get an is from an ought, sorry, an ought from an is.
Yeah. So at that point, it's not. So this would be like the abductive approach. I'm not beginning here necessarily. I'm just saying that. So yeah, I look at it like kind of like those plinko boards. Kind of like the ball falls down and hits in it. Lands and it follows a certain path or whatever. Like you could follow this path that we're following so far and be like, okay, I need a ground normativity. Where do I go? And boom, I end up with God. I'm not looking at it like that. I'm looking at it as like, well, I believe in God for other reasons, and like I just get this bonus explanation, and it grounds normativity. And the idea that, well, why ought I do X, Y, and Z? Why should I live a good moral life? I mean, yes, it's good for me, but why should I do things that are good for me? Like, why should I do things that are good for others? Or why ought I, unless it's not got a biological reason, but also like normative reasons that aren't moral. Like, why should, I don't know, why should we follow reason? Like, why should I live my life a certain way? You see what I mean? So these things, it's like, well, they need satisfying answers, I think, because that's just what anybody from when we were very young follow, and then that satisfying reason. So again, like I would arrive at God on independent grounds, and then this would just be like a bonus. Like, well, of course, like if I'm looking for if I'm looking for a satisfying explanation, I'm going to find that in something I'd already bought into. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but I'm just asking, okay, how does God ground that? So you might have God and you
Mm.
might say, okay, this is an added bonus that God can ground
Yeah.
normativity. But how does God ground normativity in a way that an atheist couldn't appeal to for some reason?
Yeah. So I'd go back to those three possible reasons. It's not going to be that it has no explanation. It's not going to be that the explanation is within. It's going to be that the explanation is without. Um, and so, how does it work as far as like functionally? The idea that how would God ground these things? I think in the same way that if I say to my son, "You ought not do this thing," I would have a reason or an explanation as to why you ought not do these things. And that would be grounded in certain things like for his health and for his moral development and so on and so on. That's much different, of course, but just given the analogy of how a parent would do it for a child. Now, how God would ground it, it would be that plus, of course, we'd go back to like, I don't know if you saw that video on Euthyphro Dilemma, how the classical theist just identifies God with the good, but you might be familiar
Well,
with the
I
solution
know that I
already.
know that
Yeah.
response. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So that would be that would be what I mean by God being the ground of normativity, is just the good then, and in this context, the proper explanation, the satisfying explanation, the good reason why I ought to do a certain thing. That's not going to be something exterior. It's going to be interior to God's character. It's because God just is the good. God is goodness as himself. And so when I say that's grounded in God, that's what I'm saying. It's being in line with God's character. And this gets into some sort of like, you can go mysticism here if you wanted to, but I don't think you I suppose you could go there eventually, but like even before that step, Christian thinkers talk about being unified with God and even loving God. And then Thomas Aquinas talks about how love is two things. It's willing the good of the other. So God does this with us. He wills our good, and also wanting to be unified with the object of love. And so this idea that if God wills my good and that I want to be unified with God, God wants to be unified with me. That's what we're talking about. Like when we're approaching the character of God, approaching holiness, like that's what I'm doing. So that it gets into, at that point, maybe beyond that, we would get into some mysticism, but yeah, that would be some philosophical explanations as well. What does that sound like? Probably not too gobbledygook, I hope.
No, I do understand the tone position. I think Craig takes a position as like God is good. I understand that, but that's not grounding normativity. That's grounding morality. So I as an
Mhm,
atheist, no, I'm not actually, but if I was an
mhm.
atheist, I could just say, okay, pleasure is the good, and that's how I ground normativity. But you're not grounding normativity. You're grounding goodness. How do I ground the fact that you ought do what maximizes the goodness, and you ought not do what maximizes the badness? Right? How would you
Mhm.
derive that in a way an atheist couldn't?
I think it would just be, so God being identified with the good, we start there, and then the ought is just you ought to worship God and be united with God. That is where the ought would be driven. In other words, that I should prefer God, creator, over something that's not God, not creator.
Where'd you derive that, or that should from an atheist couldn't?
That's a great question. It gets into some real ontological questions. This is really fascinating here because I think that when God creates, he, you know, C.S. Lewis talked about this existential argument for God, this longing. Like we're kind of left with like a hole in our heart, some people put it, and that we're drawn to that. This sort of like, I know that I'm made for something else. I want to live on forever, although I can't. And of course many atheists will say, well, don't give in to that. But it's like Christians have an explanation for why that desire is there, not just present in one or two people, but universally it's present. Of why we want to live on, why we desire the divine. um, and I think, interestingly, if you wanted to think about normativity being baked in, I think that's just kind of a standard default preset on human souls, like human minds, that we are drawn to beautiful things. We're drawn to divine things. Um, and I think when God
But
creates, there's part of Him, like made in the image of God, that seeks back to its Creator. That's where I'd kind of
mhm.
locate or try to start to locate. I haven't really thought much about what grounds normativity, but that's probably where I'd start to locate it.
The problem is you're still deriving an ought from an is. You still got, okay, the soul is this
Yeah,
way, the soul desires this, so
yeah,
the soul ought to unify with that. I mean, as an atheist, I could say the same thing. I could say, okay, the
hmm
soul desires pleasure, the soul wants to be unified with pleasurable experiences, so we ought to do this. That's not how I do it. Obviously, I say it's baked into reality, but you're doing something that an atheist could equally do, and I don't see the relevant difference between atheism and theism here.
right. And I think, yeah, I think I we also touched base on this again in comments because I think, and I confess my ignorance here because I they think there are some Thomistic accounts, like I mentioned today or yesterday to you, that do seek to just start with normativity basic like this. God made it this way. Um, so even if you start with the description, this is the way that things are. I mean, the fact that like they don't see it as odd distinction, like the way that things are, just the way they ought to be. So So now I think the question then would be like, does the atheist have recourse to that in the same way as what you're suggesting? I suppose they could. I mean, theoretically speaking, they could go down that route. But then at that point, it's like, okay, well, what is the relevant difference in the payoffs and the difference in explanations, if that makes sense? Like the idea is that you have God who grounds this, and you have this full, robust, wholehearted explanation with respect to the creator creating and creatures being drawn back to the creator and everything. On atheism, it's just like it goes back to that brute factness part of it. And it's just, yeah, I mean, I suppose you would, if you're building an ontology, you could arrive here, but you'd kind of be stuck that point at a really, I mean, and some people do this, like, not to say that this is impossible, but I think some people do this. And then it just, yeah, to me, I find that just really unsatisfying, if that makes sense.
Well, so in a Thomist view or a Christian view, broadly, you would have the brute fact that God is good. So you'd have the brute fact that if God were to
Yeah,
exist, he would be the object of goodness. That's
yeah.
no different from a utilitarian atheistic perspective, where if pleasure exists, pleasure is the good. So to me, they're equally as brute. I don't see why the theistic hypothesis does any more explanatory
Mm.
work in this context.
Well, even I think Aristotle recognized, he recognized the function that pleasure plays, but like, I think this is in book 1, I think chapter 3 or 4 or 5, where he's discussing like the 3 kinds of life. He's already identified the summum bonum, the telos, the ultimate telos of human beings, which is eudaimonia, of course, to flourish. And he says, basically, the next step is like, well, how do I arrive at that? He doesn't really frame it this way, but it's the idea of like, okay, what kind of life should I live so that I can arrive at that telos? And he does consider pleasure, but immediately tosses it away as an explanation because he thinks it's too, it's not intrinsic, it's too instrumental of a good. Like, I'm always seeking pleasure for the sake of something else. And so he, obviously eudaimonia would be the ultimate telos in the sense for him, in the sense of being the real purely intrinsic thing. But there are 3 lives that he considers. One is the life of virtue, and then the life of honor, and then the life, he does consider life of pleasure. But I think, yeah, so if I were to seek pleasure my whole life, it doesn't seem like I would end up flourishing. That he's the argument he's going to make. So I don't know if this helps at all, but I'm just recalling these things kind of stream of consciousness.
So
Like, I
maybe
don't know if he'd find it
pleasure aside.
satisfying if pleasure would. In other words, I don't think he'd find it fitting that pleasure would be a brute fact and the ultimate basic good, even on Aristotle. Yeah.
So I could put pleasure aside. I could use any example. I could say
Okay.
virtue is the good. I could say whatever is the good. This is just an example. So
Okay.
from what I understand, you're saying, okay, the theist can ground goodness in God. They can say God is good. That is whatever sort of fact it is. And from whatever sort of metaphysic they have, they can ground normativity. Going back to your claim that atheists can't bridge the result gap, but theists can, which I think you made that claim in one of your videos. Why
Mm-hmm.
can't the atheists do the same thing? I'm just not seeing that difference. Why can't the atheists say we have this objective good, which is whatever, it could be pleasure, it could be virtue,
Mm-hmm.
it could be the goodwill, it could be anything. Why can't they do the same thing and just say, okay, well, you just ought to do that because that's what the soul desires, or whatever?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess at the end of the day, I'm not feeling the pull of this intuition that it's, yeah, that things like pleasure or virtue, whatever it may be, can ground out in something basic. Because it seems to me like it's just obvious that it can't. Like, I would always
What
be,
do you
in other
mean
words, I would
ground out as
always,
being basic?
in other words, it's just being a brute fact. That's the origin of normativity. It seems like it'd always be something that I could say, well, why do that? Why do that?
Why do
Why
pleasure?
ought I to do that? Yeah, why ought I
Why,
to do that?
like I said, there's something about God, right? Why ought you? Um,
Mm-hmm.
I guess you're a natural law theorist. Why ought I follow the telos of my natural faculties? I don't know if that's how you'd construe natural law theory,
Mm-hmm.
but why ought I do that? I could ask you the same question, right?
Yeah, yeah. I would just say that that's not just how I was evolutionarily programmed, or just blindly kind of randomly programmed, but that's how God programmed me. So
Yeah.
I have that
Why also
explanation
follow
there.
God's program?
I think because it's most fitting, it's most apt, and yeah, that
So
seems right to me.
I feel like that's a normative claim as well, right? So either
And
so
it's for my good, and
what,
it's because I was told to. If that makes sense.
okay, so you're grounding
But
normativity.
but sorry, but you're
Okay.
seeing like you're getting answers there that are like, well, why should I do this? And you're getting a because, but it's not a brute
Mhm,
because. So so for
mhm.
me, that's
But it will ground off
satisfying.
in a brute, right?
The brute that it grounds out in is something like God is good, and that I follow what God says I ought to do because God is good and because I trust God. And if I do trust God, which that's uh, that's it's good that I do that because it's representative of reality. Then so the bruteness grounds out in just God's goodness.
So what does it mean God says I ought to do something?
What do you mean? What does it mean?
So you have this um, being of pure act, who is goodness, who is numerically identical to what is good, and he has set up this natural order. When God says you ought to follow this natural order, like what does that mean? Does that mean he's prescribing goodness, or he's prescribing um, normativity subjectively? I just don't see how God could.
That's one way people
Um,
go. I don't think that. Well, I don't take a subjective approach with respect to God. Just says this, but I think even if you did, it would still carry the weight that a human subjectivism wouldn't. But
so
sorry
okay,
to interrupt.
so
Go ahead.
God objectively says you ought to do things,
hmm
right?
hmm
But where does that ought in what God is saying come from?
I
That's what
think
I'm
that
asking.
yeah. So two things: negative reinforcement and positive reinforcement. The positive reinforcement is for my good. Negative reinforcement is because there's punishment if I don't, and that punishment can include scary things like hell and eternal damnation, or it could just be natural consequences. Like if I don't do this, I'm
Well,
going to end up being a certain
that
kind of person.
punishment isn't categorical. That punishment isn't sort of categorical normative. It's just you ought to do this because you don't like the consequences if you don't. And same with the positive reinforcement. I mean, if you say, okay, you ought to do this because it is good, you're still deriving or trying to derive an ought from an is. You've got it is good, so you
hmm
ought to do it. That's the view I take. I think
hmm
fundamentally, if something is good, you ought to do it. So I'd say it's baked into reality. It's baked into the nature of moral
hmm
goodness. You could take the
Yeah.
same route, but I'm taking that route as a non-theist,
Yeah.
right? That's
Yeah.
what I'm doing. So again, there seems to be no relevant difference. And okay,
Well.
that's about the positive reinforcement. The
Well.
negative
Okay.
reinforcement, isn't that egoism in some sense?
Yeah. So I hold a virtue ethics view, not an egoistic view. Um, It
Well,
shares features. It shares features with egoism, and sometimes gets flack for this. But it's not just for like so. Ethical egoist is all about I ought to do things for my own good, even if it's going to hurt other people. The virtue ethicist does not take that approach. I'm doing things for my own good and for my own flourishing, and the things I do for other people is also for my own flourishing as well because I'm becoming a kind of person. But ultimately, and you see this in Aristotle, like he says things like, well, the social good is like actually the ultimate good. And then later in the Nicomachean Ethics, he gets into friendship and he gets into how to cultivate moral education in society and what's good for society overall. So like it's clear in my view in the Nicomachean Ethics that it's not just about individuals, it's about groups of individuals, namely societies. So even on virtue ethics of Aristotelian kind and again into Thomism, you get not just like this utter egoism where it's just all about the individual, but it's about my good for the sake of others and their good. Like some virtues, like it's impossible, I think, to cultivate certain virtues without the help of others, like compassion. Like I need another agent there to be compassionate to, or truthfulness. Like we do say, oh, I need to be true to myself or tell myself the truth or something. I think that's derivative. Like in order for it to function properly in the way it's supposed to function, like you need another human being there. And so that may be the case with many, if not most, virtues. So yeah. Yeah, all that to say, and I know you said some other things there, and maybe you can repeat what you said that I didn't catch, but just with respect to the hedonism part. But what else did you say?
The part before, or
Yeah.
I think it was just saying that okay, you have X is for my good, therefore I ought to do it. But that's the same thing
Mhm.
an atheist could do. An
Right.
atheist could say pleasure is good, so I ought to do it.
Yeah.
It's again baking normativity into
Yeah.
reality.
Well, I think that you can dissect what the atheist or non-theist is saying at that point when they say it is good, therefore I ought to do it. People give different variations on what good is. Does that mean one's welfare and well-being? Does that mean good in the sense of pleasure? Does that mean good in the sense of usefulness,
Uh,
utility?
the
It's going to depend on
morally
how
good.
they. Okay, so it is morally good, they ought to do it. And there I would just say, well, where's the moral goodness coming from? And so many atheists, they'll say, well, it's evolutionarily, biologically, derived or something. But you're just saying it's just fundamental. But how did it get there?
Well, I could ask the same thing, right? I could say, oh, how did God come to be good? How did that get there, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So
Under your view, I guess.
right, and of course I'm going to answer that it is God's always been good. Of course, He's not changed. He's unchangeable, immutable, and that just is His character. He's identical to the good.
Yeah.
But for the atheists, it's not just that goodness exists. Like for the theist, goodness exists in someone's character. And that's just how it looks for you and me, like human beings. You have goodness in someone's characters and actions and so on. For an atheist who just looks at the universe as just like this kind of, for a lack of a better phrase, something like a cold, dark place, like these normative facts just seem to they don't seem to be inherent in anything. They don't inhere in a person necessarily. I mean, they do, but like you're saying, if it's a fundamental aspect of just the universe as a whole. I mean, could I ask you, like, do you think that, on your view, that goodness would exist even if there were no people in the universe?
What do you mean goodness? Do you mean there would be something which is good, or the object of good exists? There's
So I
a
guess,
distinction there.
yeah, yeah, that's a good question because it depends on if you want to go Platonic or Aristotelian here.
Well,
Let's go
I do
Aristotelian.
have.
Like in the
I've been
absence of
thinking
human
about that.
beings, yeah. So in the absence of
Uh,
human beings, there are no people around to uh, be the basis of a good moral character or even good moral actions, good moral intentions, and so on. So would there still be goodness in the universe absent human beings? Moral goodness.
well, I'll try and answer that, and I'll try and go back to what I was saying before. But
Okay, go ahead.
under my view, let's just assume my view is Platonist.
Okay.
I think it's logically true. So the same as 1 + 1 = 2. The same that you you can't have a square circle. Pleasure is the good. That's what I think. So even if there were no people,
Yeah.
that truth would still pertain. But pleasure itself wouldn't
Okay.
pertain because, of course, you need agents to have pleasure in their mind, right? So that's a
Yeah.
distinction. But going back to what I was saying before, you say God is good. God is the object of goodness, which
Hmm.
grounds normativity. And you just accept that if something is good, it can ground normativity. You say you view that as sort of just a fundamental truth. Why
Yeah.
can't the atheist do the same? Why can't the atheist just say, um, we have pleasure, and pleasure is the object of goodness, so pleasure can ground normativity. Now, you sort of talked about grounding in God's character. I would
Hmm.
question that. I don't think the goodness of God is grounded in God qua a person. The goodness of God is grounded in God qua God's nature. So it's not.
Hmm. Yeah, that's
I
right.
think that
Yeah,
avoids
I'm just using character as
subjective.
like a helpful heuristic, but it's not meant to be
Yeah.
technical. But you're right. Yeah.
Um.
Yeah. So
So sorry. Yeah.
so at the end of the day, I think just it would then be a difference in the object, or I prefer to say the subject of the goodness, where it's seated, in scholastic terms, seated under something. Um, and so the theist is going to say it's God. The atheist is going to say this is why I asked. I was like, where would goodness be located? Would it be existed at all? And you say, and so I guess it would be an emergent property of humans. That's, understandable things, like or maybe not emergent, could be emergent, but in the sense that it's like yeah, it would be, yeah. Anyway, so and so then at the end of the day, it would be like, okay, well, what if we're just comparing those two things, the object or the subjects, let's say, of goodness, where it's seated, like how do those two things fare? And so I'm going to say it's God, and that can ground out in his character's nature, whatever you have you. And it seems to do those things quite well. Like if you're just thinking within the confines of a theory, like it has a lot of theoretical explanation, a lot of theoretical scope, and so on and so on. For the atheist, sorry, or the non-theist who says, well, it's just going to ground out in I don't know what, and so that's that fill in the blank. And they have options, of course, but like where is that goodness located? Where is that goodness situated and seated and then like does it have the same theoretical and explanatory scope and power is the God does? And that I think that's where I'm thinking like this one wins
Yeah.
out because it just have more explanatory power and scope, if that makes sense.
So I don't think we could get into a whole debate about the
Yeah.
explanatory power of God as a theory, but I'll try and stay away from that. I don't
Yeah.
think that shows how atheists can't ground normativity and theists can. So you
Mm,
say that, okay, theists can ground it in the nature of God and atheists can ground it in whatever, I don't know. But the theist can ground it in the nature of God and the atheist can ground it in the nature of anything. If they wanted to,
right.
they might have their own arguments, their own whatever.
Yeah.
I happen to ground it in the nature of pleasure. So I say goodness is pleasure. That's part of the nature of goodness, part of the nature of pleasure. You say that goodness is in the nature of God and God is in the nature of goodness, or however you want to
Mhm.
construe it. What's the relevant difference here again? But that one can ground normativity and the other one can't.
That so at that point you're right. So let me rephrase what you saw in the other video with one caveat. I think that the non-theist could, let's say, attempt to, in parentheses, I like using parentheses, attempt to ground normativity in whatever it is in their ontology that they're working with. Like I say, I fill in the blank. Um, but at the end of the day, it's going to be a matter of like feasibility. Like, does it have the explanatory scope and power? And I think that theism does, and then the non-theistic. So because some non-theistic views, like uh, panpsychism, they do this. Like I think I mentioned this comment. They do this with consciousness, and so it's hard to explain consciousness just coming into a naturalistic, materialistic world. If you start with matter, how do you get something like consciousness? It's not matter, not identical to matter. That somehow springs from it. We're having the same trouble here in the same kind of form of the problem with respect to normativity. And so they like you're attempting to do like bake it in to some whatever already. So the panpsych is just going to say, well, just consciousness is everywhere. It's in everything. Matter just is conscious already. And so that's one way to do it. I'm not saying that you're doing that in the idea that everything is normative, but that just it would already be present, and so you don't have that problem. Um,
But
and
isn't that the
so,
same thing you're doing? You're just baking normativity into what goodness is. So this is where I'm
Mhm.
getting at. I'll try and
Okay,
explain as best I can.
sure.
Okay, we have atheism and we have theism. Under your theism, you have God is the object of goodness, and what is good is what ought to be done. You have those two facts and you tie them together. The atheist can do the same thing.
Mhm,
They can have, for example, pleasure is the object of good, and what is good ought to be done. These are the
mhm,
exact same claims. There's no relevant difference between theism and atheism. So you might say God has more explanatory power, but speaking in the context of what we're speaking in the context of metaethics, why does that show that theism can ground normative claims and atheism can't?
yeah. So I think they could attempt to, like I said, but I think that you might be underappreciating what it means for God to ground, and normativity, and to say, and maybe I'm just not explaining it well. Um, but to when God says something is good versus when a human being says, "Oh, that's good. I recognize it as such." Like that, worlds apart, infinitely apart.
But
Like when God says
it's not that
something's good
God
versus,
saying it's not that God's
in
saying
some
something is good.
cases, it
It's that God is
is
good. So you're saying from your
right.
perspective, God
That
is
would
the
be
object
the
of goodness. I'm saying from
yeah,
my perspective, for example, pleasure is the object of goodness. From
yeah,
our perspective, not from God's, I don't see the difference. And
mm,
even if you say from God's perspective, what allows God to make normative truths out of non-normative ones?
mm. Yeah. I'm not sure. Yeah. I'll have to think more about this, but I think it does parallel in form anyway with respect to panpsychism. The idea that you would want to somehow avoid that problem. If I were to be pushed on this, like you're doing now, I think I'd say that the theist doesn't have to worry about deriving in ought from an is. And you're pressing here to say,
Right.
well, I don't think that the atheist would have to worry about that either. And I think that that's true on some versions, some worldviews, like that if you want to just bake it in, yeah, that's fine. But then at that point, it becomes a conversation about, well, which one has the explanatory stuff? Yeah, so that's kind of
Well,
where I'm
I guess
settling here. But if you want to give the last word
maybe just to
here,
close it off. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, sure.
What I was originally asking was, how can an atheist derive? Sorry, how can a theist derive an ought from an is, but an atheist can't? And
Hmm.
I guess I've
Yep.
presented a worldview which doesn't suppose God, which can do the same thing that the theistic worldview can. So maybe the theistic hypothesis has more explanatory virtues and
Hmm.
perhaps more parsimonious or something like that. But I think it's still been shown that the atheist, well, if we just take atheism to be the belief there are no gods, can do the exact same thing that theism can in respect to morality, putting aside other ideas of
Hmm.
explanatory virtue in other domains, right?
Hmm.
That's what I'd say to finish off.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, cool. Well, I will give this more thought. It's also worth mentioning it you brought up when you're let me just say this final thing and then I'll give you the last word if you like to press back on this, but when you're doing like theory building, parsimony is just one criterion, of course.
Yeah,
That's why I mentioned other things like explanatory scope, explanatory power. You have I guess beauty, some things, orderliness, and so on and so on. And there's a lot of these criteria when it comes to theory building. The one that we usually glom onto, of course, is parsimony. And that's only in the case of all things are equal. Like, um, you should prefer the simpler one, or don't multiply necessities beyond, don't multiply entities beyond necessity. Um, yeah, but I think taking into account all these, that's why I went that direction of explanatory scope, explanatory power. At that point, it would be okay. Now that we've got two theories, and you're right, you taught me something here today. Like you were like, okay, you could just, and so on the record, I can go back and say, yes, atheists can, on some views, attempt to derive normativity. It's not just to derive it, but just to say that it's already there. And so they don't have to worry about the is-ought problem. That's fine with me. And that's why I said, okay, now at that point, you're just going to have to like compare the two theories or, postulations or something. So, but anyway, you want to give the last word here and then we'll let
yeah,
somebody
yeah.
else on?
Well, I mean, yeah. I'm not going to necessarily disagree with you, but I think that you can take other views apart from theory building. I guess there are other ways of deciding what view to believe in. But I think, yeah, at the end of the day, atheism and theism can equally ground normativity. There are some theistic views which you would say can't ground normativity. There are some atheistic views
Mm-hmm.
which you would say can't ground normativity. I don't think there's anything intrinsic to either view um, that says anything about grounding normativity per se. So I think that's what I'd
Gotcha.
finish off
Gotcha.
on.
Cool. All right. Well, it was a
Well,
pleasure as
thank you very
always.
much.
Definitely. Thank you for coming on and I'll see you next time.
Bye.
All right. See ya. All right. Cool.